What's up guys, this episode we're going to be implementing user @mentions in ActionText and tricks, which is going to be pretty awesome. So this is a feature that's been highly requested. Almost every website these days has this feature somewhere, and so that's what we're going to be implementing today. Now what's cool about this is that we are going to be using Zerb's Tribute.js library so that when you type the @ symbol in tricks editor and some characters after that, it will autocomplete and allow us to select a user. So this is going to work really nicely with tricks. So we're going to have Zerb actually insert a tricks attachment for the user. Now, normally when you hear the word attachment, you think of PDFs or images or other uploads that you might want to do, but this is different. Tricks attachments are just objects that live inside of tricks as a unit. And so what we're going to end up doing is implementing user mentions in tricks with a custom attachment. Then ActionText is going to pull that out and then minify it and strip it out and use a global ID to reference the user record in our database. That way when it renders it again, it can pull the user out of the database and use their current avatar in case it changed, or their name if that had happened to have changed as well. So this is going to work really nicely and be a cool feature to implement, especially with ActionText, because there's not any documentation on this stuff just yet. There's even a bug that we're going to talk about in this episode that I submitted a PR for, which is cool. So what we need first off is to have ActionText installed. That's all you really need. You're going to need this like so, where you have some sort of model and you have an ActionText rich text field somewhere. So in the last video, if you want to see how to set this up, we created these posts and configured ActionText to allow us to render rich text and do file uploads here. So take a look at that last episode, which will be in the notes below if you haven't set this up before. So let's dive into adding user mention. First things first, we're going to run Rails Webpacker :install stimulus because we want to make sure that we have stimulus support, because we're going to use stimulus to implement the JavaScript coordination of Tribute and tricks together. And that's going to be as simple as that is. Next up, we're going to run yarn add Tribute.js. This is the Zerb Tribute JavaScript library that we're going to use to power the dropdown for our mentions. Then we're going to go to the routes in our application and we're going to add resources mentions, and we're just going to want the index for this. So this is going to be the URL that we hit to do the autocomplete for our users. So they're going to load dynamically, and this is the JSON endpoint we're going to hit. So let's create that controller, app controllers mentions controller.rb, which will be mentions controller, and it inherits from application controller, and we'll have an index for this, and we just need to query the users out of the database. And then we want to respond to do format.json. So we want to render a JSON response for this and really only accept a JSON request. One other thing you could do here is we're going to pass in a param called query, which will be the first characters of the name that was typed. And so you might want to pass this along to a search on your database or Elasticsearch or something like that to filter out the results for autocomplete. We're just going to leave it as user.all in this example, but keep in mind you're going to want to replace this with a search so you don't return every single user. If you have 10,000 users, you want to just return like the first 10 or something like that. So keep that in mind. Then when we've got this, we're going to need to make a directory called @viewsmentions. Then we can create a file in there called @viewsmentions index.json.jbuilder. This file is going to create an array for our users, and we're going to return a partial users user as user. And this is just going to go through each one of those users, render that partial, and set the local variable as user in order to do that. And I want to make sure that this is user's user because we want to render out an individual user, and so that should be singular for the template name. Then we can create the directory for @viewsUsers, and then edit @viewsUsers_user.json.jbuilder. And here's going to be similar. We're going to extract from the user their ID and their name, and then we need to implement the two keys that we want for action text. First is the SGID, second is the content. Now we want to call some method on the user to get the SGID, and to do that, we're going to include the ActionText attachable module onto our user. This is going to add a few methods that will make it compatible with ActionText, namely an attachable SGID method. This is going to give us a signed global ID, or SGID, and this will allow us to then remove basically all the HTML when we save our mention to the database. And then ActionText is going to look, when we render it again, it will look for the SGID and say, oh, this is for a user with the ID of number 1. So let's go look up that record in the database and render that out. And so it's going to automatically render the user's user partial, whatever your to partial path is on your user, or whatever attachable model that you were using. So then we can say attachable SGID, and ActionText will know to render out the correct partial for us when it renders it out on the show view. So that's going to work for us, and we want to actually just render out that exact same partial right now by doing users user, where locals, we want to pass in the user that we're operating on, and we want to use the format HTML only. So ActionText, when it displays your attachment, will automatically render this partial by default. So we're going to render this out so that when we're editing in the form, we can render the partial and then insert it so it looks exactly the same when we're editing as when we show it. So that's what we want to do now. So let's create app views users user HTML ERB. So in here you can have any HTML content you want. We might say let's make it a span with the mention class so we can target and style this with CSS or something, and we want to just print out the user's name. But it might be nice to have something like the user's avatar, which you could grab from the navbar, and here we could say let's just display our gravatar for the user. And we'll change the user.email to match accordingly to the right variable. So this is what our mentions will look like. They'll just be an image next to some text wrapped in a span. So now let's open up our browser and go to mentions.json. And we see here that we see all our users in our database and their SGID and their content. So all of this is great and gives us everything we need to go build out our front end. So first things first, let's dive into the post form where we have our rich text area, and let's add a controller to this for stimulus. So we'll call our controller, creatively we'll call it mentions, and we're gonna add a target here called mentions.field. And this is just gonna allow us to reference this field easily in our code. And in case you decided to move this somewhere else or whatever, you could put your controller up above, even around your HTML, and you could put your mentions inside, whatever it is. That's just going to give us access to the field really easily. So then we can create a controller for this. Now I'm just going to cheat a little bit and grab the hello controller.js. We will grab that as our template and create app JavaScript controllers mentions controller.js. We'll paste that in and grab the static targets and connect here, and we want to change output as the target to field. So we just define that, and basically we want to create a reference to our editor, our tricks editor, from this.field target.editor. So that's going to give us access to that to use later on to insert our attachments and do other things like deleting text and so on. Next thing is we want to set up tribute. So we're going to have a this.initialize tribute method that we'll call, and we'll just define that right here, initialize tribute. And this method is going to need to have access to tribute. So we're going to import tribute from tribute.js at the top here, and we'll also import tricks from tricks. So that'll give us our imports that we'll use later on, and we're going to use the tribute one right now. We'll say new tribute and we'll pass in a couple options. One is allow spaces, so we want to allow spaces in our names, and we want lookup to look on the name key. So when we're looking at our mentions, we want this name attribute to be the one that we're auto-completing on. Next up, we want values, and this is going to call a method called fetchUsers, and we will define fetchUsers, and that will take some text and a callback. And this method is where we will make a request to our Rails JSON endpoint to grab those. So we'll say /mentions.js, and we can pass in the query text here with text. And then once we get some response back, we can convert the response to JSON. And then once we have some JSON, we can call the callback with that JSON. So that will be our array of users. And in this case, we could even call this users to be a bit more descriptive. Then we also want to have a catch. If there was an error, we want to call the callback and just pass in an empty array just so that it has some data to work with, even if it is just an empty array. So this is really setting up Tribute and doing everything for us. We want to probably also disconnect and say this dot tribute dot detach this dot field target whenever we navigate away and the stimulus controller gets torn down, because this dot tribute dot attach will be the next thing that we do. So this will basically go ahead and set Tribute to run on our rich text field. So that will connect it to tricks and then handle the keyboard presses and stuff so that this will intercept any of those @mentions that we might want to do. And we should be able to see that this works in our browser now if we refresh. Now open up the JavaScript console to make sure that you don't have any JavaScript errors, because if you do, you might have made a typo or something like that. But now, once we have no errors, we should be able to type the @ symbol, see that drop down show up, even though it has no styles yet. And then you can type and fill those out. If you hit enter, it doesn't do what you would expect it to. It just says undefined, and the reason for that is there was no value to actually insert in there that matched their defaults. So we are going to actually get rid of all of the stuff that they do and implement our own version that interacts with tricks instead. So what we'll do is we'll say this.tribute .range.paste HTML. We're going to override that method with our own paste HTML method, and we'll bind to the current scope. And our version will be paste HTML, and it will take the HTML start position of where you started typing and your end position of that as well. And we're going to actually convert this over to this.editor.get position so that we know in tricks where we're at. And then we can say this.editor.set selected range. We want the position minus the end position, and we want to go to the position. So that sets the range that we're going to highlight, and then we're just going to set editor.delete in direction backward. And so that's going to delete those characters that were just added by the user, so that we delete those, and we're not going to insert anything from Tribute. We're actually going to do our own callback for that. So here we're going to have this.fieldTarget.add event listener, and we will say Tribute replaced, and we'll call a method called this.replaced, and that one will define here replaced, and it will take an event, and we'll have our event, and we can look up the original user mention that we received back by going to e.detail.item.original. That will give us the JSON item from here that we actually matched against. So this object like so, if we type test user, it would grab us this JSON content, and then we can go and create our tricks attachment. So let's say let attachment equals new tricks.attachment, and we're going to pass in the SGID most importantly. So mention.sgid. We're going to paste in our content for that. So we want mention.content, and that is all we really need to pass over. These are two important keys that are allowed by tricks and ActionText. So if you pass in other things, it might get stripped out. So keep that in mind as you go ahead and do this. SGID and content are the required ones that we're going to need to make this work. So we're then going to grab the tricks editor again and insert attachment at the current position. And then we'll say this .editor.insert string of a single space, because it's usually good to type a user's name and then have a space and continue typing without having to hit that space yourself. So now if we hop back to our browser, we can type a user, select them, and you'll see that we get their avatar and the user. So if you inspect this, the way that Tricks works is that you have a figure, and that is a wrapper around the HTML content. So this figure kind of represents the attachment itself, and it works similarly when it gets rendered out. There's actually a wrapper HTML tag around your HTML content, but you'll see inside of here the span class of mention. That is the content that we created. So attachments have some content, and they also can have an optional caption. Ours is empty, so there's nothing there. And what this will do is it will get serialized and basically removed and minified. So our HTML that we wrote here is just going to disappear when it's saved to the database, but it will keep a reference to this user so it knows to actually render out the exact same partial when we render our rich text like we see here. Now there's a problem to this though. If we hit edit, our attachment's gone. And this is actually a bug as it seems in ActionText currently. I've made a PR to basically fix this and have a good default for it so it's automatically assuming the same partial in both situations. But for now, you can go to your model and define a method called toTricks content attachment partial path and define that method just to call the toPartialPath method and delegate to that. So that's going to basically tell it when you're rendering the same attachment in Tricks, you need a little bit different layout. So go ahead and render the same partial though. So now if we do that, we're fixed and it's consistent in both cases. So that's really cool. What's awesome about this is that if we go to our user's user HTML ERB and we decided, hey, let's make this link to a user. Let's add resources users and change this span to a link to user, and we'll say class is mentioned still. We can make a change like so. And if we refresh, it will use that link now, which is pretty cool. So this is going to set it up, even though we haven't implemented the user's controller or anything like that. We can go and modify this, and so as you edit text and other things, these will always be up-to-date attachments. So if you're referring to, on GitHub, if you're referring to an issue or a pull request or a user or a repository, and any of those names or content ends up changing, this is going to allow you to actually reference the latest version of that all the time. It's a lot better than actually referencing the HTML that you originally generated and just saving that permanently. So this is really awesome, and this is really where ActionText shines. The last thing I want to point out here is how to add a little bit of styling to this. Your attachments in Tricks you can just inspect, and you can take a look at those and figure out what you want to do with the figures and the content inside of them. We added a little bit of CSS in the last episode for our attachments and attachment previews, so they display inline block, but our attachment previews actually take up the full width and are centered. Then I've also added some CSS here for tribute so that you can have a nice little shadowed drop down and white background here like so. So it allows you to select those users, and it also even highlights the text that it's matching on. So we'll put a span around the text that it is matched. So here you can see that war is bold in the rest of it. is not. So you know what you're matching on. So that's pretty cool and easy to use. So that is all there is to it. This is how you would set up @user mentions in Tricks with ActionText as the background, but it also works for any kind of custom attachments you might want to add as well. You're going to need to include that ActionText attachable and then have content and SGID in the Tricks attachment that you insert into the editor. And that is about it. And we will probably continue on with some more of this stuff in the future, but for now, that is it for this episode, and I will talk to you in the next one. Peace.